To travel around Britain in search of the rural landscapes that have inspired great writers to put quill to parchment will reveal some truly beautiful locations. From Thomas Hardy's Wessex to Jane Austen's Hampshire, George Eliot's Warwickshire, the Bronte sisters' Yorkshire, and D.H. Lawrence's Nottinghamshire. My name is Liam Dale, and I'd be delighted to escort you back in time in this programme to follow in the footsteps of Charles Dickens, one of literature's most esteemed heroes.
Welcome to Gads Hill Place, the much-loved home of Charles Dickens, the house that as an impressionable child he'd vowed to own one day. This truly is a rags-to-riches tale to rival anything the great man ever penned. And although it may seem rather strange to begin our journey where Charles Dickens died, rather than where he was born, Gads Hill played such a significant role in our author's story, which makes it a great place to start.
The setting is beautiful. The Kent countryside at its magnificent best, close to the historic town of Rochester. It was a landscape that would influence Charles Dickens his whole life long, and he spent much of his childhood in this district, while his father John was employed as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office based at Chatham, one of the neighbouring Medway towns of southeast England. And it was while out walking with his father as a child that Charles Dickens first encountered Gads Hill Place. John Dickens, as you'll discover a little later, may not have been the ideal father, but he did tell his young son, as they stood gazing upon this magnificent house, that if he worked really hard and never lost sight of his dream, Gads Hill Place could become his home. In fact, the reason why we are so sure that this incident really did take place is because it was a story that Charles Dickens often recounted, and it actually found its way into print many years later in The Uncommercial Traveller, where you'll find these familiar words. Ever since I can recollect, my father, seeing me so fond of it, has often said to me, if you were to be very persevering and were to work hard, you might someday come to live in it. It's not difficult to appreciate how this charming piece of fatherly advice motivated Charles Dickens when he began to make his way in the world. But we are rather racing ahead of ourselves, because it would be many years before John Dickens' prophecy was fulfilled, and to find out how it happened, we need to head for Portsmouth. Charles John Huffam Dickens was born in this modest Portsmouth house to John and Elizabeth Dickens on the 7th of February 1812. Now the Charles Dickens Birthplace Museum, and visitors can see where our author made his first rather humble appearance.
Moving on 5 years, and we've come to Chatham, 11 Ordnance Terrace to be precise. Although when John Dickens and family moved here in 1817, it was actually number 2. From Portsmouth, John Dickens had been posted to London, where, on a reduced income, his debts had started to mount up. But it was a brief stay, and by the time the family arrived here at Chatham, Charles had 2 sisters, one older and one younger, but a baby brother had died in infancy.
Although the location is far from being rural Britain at its beautiful best, when Charles Dickens lived here, there was a hayfield where the railway station stands today. As a child, he spent hours out playing, and many of the individuals he encountered, even at this early age, made a lasting impression on his blossoming imagination. His childhood friend, George Strauchill, who lived at number 1 Ordnance Terrace, emerged as the charismatic Steerforth in David Copperfield, while the Dickens family's faithful servant, Mary Weller, was immortalised as the redoubtable Clara Peggotty in the same autobiographical work. As a small boy, Charles had no idea of the debts his father had been running up, something he would do his whole life long, constantly living beyond his means. Nevertheless, the family grew in size, and inevitably, with hungry mouths to feed, it was necessary to move to more modest lodgings in Chatham. It would have been during this period in Charles Dickens's life that a walk to Higham, past Gads Hill Place, resulted in John Dickens inspiring his son to make his mark on the world. And Gads Hill was far from being the only place that captured the impressionable child's imagination. The lovely village of Cobham, where the Leather Bottle pub, as popular today with Dickens enthusiasts as it was when our author was alive, is typical of this part of Kent. But there's one delightful church in the charming village of Cooling that is visited by those on the Charles Dickens trail even more often than the Leather Bottle.
This is the church of St James at Cooling, and a walk through this graveyard will reveal a remarkable treasure for anyone interested in the works of Charles Dickens. Thought to have been the inspiration for the sinister place where young Pip encounters the malevolent convict Magwitch in Great Expectations, the opening lines of this dramatic novel leave us in no doubt whatsoever that it's the same atmospheric location that Charles Dickens was remembering. Ours was the marsh country, down by the river, within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dykes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes. Dickens only talks of 5 tragic little graves in his novel, but there are 13 tiny tombs here at Cooling, and as the church is no longer in use, you certainly get a sense of a truly eerie landscape. Nevertheless, if you ask a cross-section of people to define what makes a classically Dickensian scene, it'll often include snow, an old coaching inn, and the timbered high street of a country town. And we don't have to travel far to find the very place that was such a favourite with Charles Dickens from his earliest childhood memories right through to his dying day. This is Rochester, and for anyone hoping to catch a glimpse of Charles Dickens's ghost, I have been reliably informed that this is definitely the place to come. Either side of me, if evidence is required, you can see just how historically important Rochester is, boasting perhaps the best preserved castle in England and a cathedral that happens to be one of the nation's oldest.
Now, fascinating as the beautiful ancient architecture might be, if you're still looking for that classic Dickensian scene, you need go no further than Rochester's long straggling high street, as it was described by the man himself in Sketches by Boz, way back in 1836.
It's no wonder that the very young, impressionable and very imaginative Charles Dickens was captivated by this colourful street. Standing here today, I'm equally enthralled by this unique place. The idea of a coach and horses pulling in here to the Royal Victoria and Bull Hotel, carrying Mr. Pickwick and his friends, is as delightful as ever, and a blanket of crisp white snow would complete the picture to perfection.
Mr. Winkle, who sits at the extreme edge, with one leg dangling in the air, is nearly precipitated into the street as the coach twists round the sharp corner by the cheesemonger's shop and turns into the marketplace. And before Mr. Snodgrass, who sits next to him, has recovered from his alarm, they pull up at the inn yard where the fresh horses with cloths on are already waiting. The coachman throws down the reins and gets down himself, and the other outside passengers drop down also, except those who have no great confidence in their ability to get up again, and they remain where they are and stamp their feet against the coach to warm them, looking with longing eyes and red noses at the bright fire in the inn bar and the sprigs of holly with red berries which ornament the window. Again, I think we all now know exactly where the inspiration for this extract from the Pickwick Papers came from. But if you'd like to discover the reason for Charles Dickens's preoccupation with snow at Christmas time, join me again in just a few moments.
There's no chance of snow today, but if you come to Rochester for the annual Dickensian Christmas Festival, you're guaranteed snow, even if it does have to be of the artificial variety. But it's definitely memories of childhood that set the older Dickens writing about the pleasures of seasonal weather, because for the first 8 years of his life, it snowed every Christmas. But not all of Dickens's childhood memories were quite so happy. And in 1822, when he moved with his family back to London, the dark, dismal world that young Charles entered was as far removed from beautiful rural Kent as could possibly be imagined.
Right from John Dickens's arrival in London, the financial troubles that had beset him for so many years got progressively worse, and any hopes young Charles had of receiving an education were dashed, not least because, as the oldest boy, he'd already been put to work in Warren's blacking, a boot polish factory run by a relation of his mother. Then, to complete the humiliation of the sensitive child, John Dickens was arrested for debt and thrown into the Marshalsea prison, and the rest of the family joined him there, apart from Charles, who was left to work 10 hours a day in the factory. Eventually, an inheritance from a distant relation secured the Dickens family release, but Charles never forgave his mother for forcing him to continue at the blacking factory, although in the end his father's determination that his son should go to school won the day, and for 2 years, while in his early teens, Charles attended the Wellington House Academy, which seems quite remarkable when you return to Gads Hill Place.
It's hard to believe as I sit here in the grand house where Dickens penned such classics as A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations, that such a brief education, coupled with a little schooling at Chatham courtesy of a neighbour, was enough to set Charles on his way. Taking a junior position with London law firm Ellis and Blakemore, Dickens worked hard to rise above the impecunious habits of his father, and even taught himself shorthand, enabling him to become a parliamentary journalist, reporting on the proceedings in the House of Commons.
The law became a great fascination for Dickens, the plight of the poor who'd fallen foul of the British judiciary system even more so, and would soon become a major source of inspiration as he started to write short stories under the pen name Boz, alongside his journalistic endeavours. Things began to look up as the blossoming young writer, now in his early 20s, was able to take rooms at Furnival's Inn to become a gentleman about town, and after being commissioned to write short stories by George Hogarth, editor of the Evening Chronicle, his Sketches by Boz were quickly followed by the first instalment of the Pickwick Papers.
And you don't need me to tell you how successful Mr. Pickwick and his colourful assortment of friends proved to be from their earliest appearance. Charles Dickens was fast becoming a phenomenon, and with his unexpected rise to prominence, he married Catherine Hogarth, the daughter of the man who had, in effect, launched his son-in-law's professional writing career. When it came to choosing a honeymoon destination, Charles, as ever, reverted to the Kent of his childhood, and the newlyweds came here to Chalk, one of the loveliest English villages you're ever likely to see. This charming, timber-boarded cottage has a plaque claiming it was the house that Charles and Catherine stayed in, but it's been suggested that the original would have actually stood on the other side of the road. While here, Charles would have been writing further instalments of the Pickwick Papers, and you only have to look at the old forge to see that he was already collecting ideas that would last his entire writing career, as this is where it's believed Dickens found the inspiration for Joe Gargery's blacksmith's forge in Great Expectations.
After their honeymoon, Charles and Catherine returned to Furnival's Inn, where they were joined by Catherine's younger sister, Mary. The couple's first son, Charles Jr., was born on the 6th of January 1837, but all was far from well, as Catherine slipped into what we would recognise today as postnatal depression. As Kent evidently had great restorative powers for Charles, Catherine, baby Charles and Mary came back to Chalk, while Charles Sr. commuted between London and his family as he continued to advance his writing career. Then, in April 1837, as a successful author, still only 25 years of age, Charles Dickens secured 48 Doughty Street in the London district of Holborn for his family, and this is the only London house that Dickens lived in that's still standing. Today, it's the Charles Dickens Museum. However, it was here that tragedy struck just weeks after they all moved in, and it would influence Dickens's entire writing career, and very possibly damaged his marriage. On the 7th of May, 1837, 17-year-old Mary Hogarth, Catherine's sister, died in her brother-in-law's arms, and he was inconsolable. She became immortalised as Little Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop. But when Dickens had "Young, Beautiful and Good" inscribed on the unfortunate girl's headstone, who can say what his wife must have thought? As Oliver Twist followed the Pickwick Papers, and a succession of wonderful novels appeared in print, the moment finally came when John Dickens's prophecy that his son might one day live at Gads Hill Place came true. Charles Dickens, now in his mid-40s, was an international phenomenon. More than 30 years after his father's most astute words were spoken, Dickens' boyhood dream came true. By the time he bought Gads Hill Place in 1856, he was already arguably the most successful novelist in the English language. And should you be wondering why I've brought you here to a tunnel of all places, there's actually a very good reason. Because it runs under the main road, and Dickens had it built especially for him. Our esteemed author was given a Swiss chalet where he loved to write, and it stood immediately across the road from Gads Hill Place, which is why Dickens had the tunnel constructed, so that he could move between the house and the chalet without ever being noticed. In fact, you can find the Swiss chalet in the gardens of Eastgate House on Rochester High Street, and it does look as if it would have been an idyllic place to write. You may be thinking by now that Charles Dickens was only happy when surrounded by the Kentish landscape of his boyhood, but the east coast of the county pleased him equally well. Broadstairs was a particular favourite, and gazing out to sea was a major source of inspiration for Dickens. He always tried to spend a month here every year, in what was then called Fort House, but is now better known, not surprisingly, as Bleak House. When his travels abroad prevented him from visiting in 1844 and 46, Dickens claimed to be hankering after the good old tarry salt little pier of Broadstairs, and you can really see why. For Charles Dickens, travel became a regular part of his life, and crossing the Atlantic as he gave reading tours of America meant that he became something of a celebrity.
Finally, it seemed that Charles Dickens had overcome the torment of his youth and the squalor of London to find contentment here in the countryside that he loved so dearly. A social campaigner with a voice that was always listened to. As a writer, he did more than any politician to raise awareness of the plight of the poor, especially the children. But happiness still eluded Charles Dickens. His marriage to Catherine had failed, and in a bitter separation, he sent his wife to live away from him and their children. Although he undoubtedly fell in love with the young actress Ellen Ternan, whatever passed between them was kept secret, and Dickens drove himself relentlessly onwards, writing and giving public readings. By the time Dickens started work on The Mystery of Edwin Drood, it was again Rochester providing him with his inspiration. He talks of the old stone gatehouse crossing the close, with an arched thoroughfare passing beneath it. And you see before you the very gatehouse. Sadly, The Mystery of Edwin Drood was never completed. On a June morning, Charles Dickens stood at these gates, apparently just staring in, before returning home to Gads Hill Place. This is Restoration House, where Dickens took his inspiration for Miss Havisham's decaying mansion in Great Expectations, and it's impossible not to speculate, frankly, as to whether our author was bidding Rochester a fond farewell, because later the same day he had a stroke from which he never recovered. Charles Dickens died on the 9th of June 1870 at the age of 58, having achieved success beyond even his wildest dreams. Characteristically, he wanted to be buried in Rochester Cathedral, but the nation demanded such a literary great, who they considered to be their own, be laid to rest in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner. All we can hope, standing next to this memorial plaque, is that the wonderful words spoken by Sidney Carton to conclude A Tale of Two Cities held true for their creator, Charles Dickens, leaving the man who had loved this part of rural Britain so much to rest in peace. It is a far, far better thing that I do now than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known.
And on that poignant note, all that remains is to thank you for allowing me to be your guide through the evocative Kent countryside that so captivated Charles Dickens, and cordially invite you to join me again next time to visit another of Britain's beautiful landscapes, which inspired the creation of further great works of classic literature.